Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will look at the continuing violence in Myanmar, along with the flip-flop that Pakistan has been doing on the issue of trade with India. Very interesting is that President Biden has invited about 40 leaders for a virtual summit on climate. India has been invited, and Prime Minister Modi has accepted the invitation. Pakistan is out of that invitation. So we will look at all of that on this episode of the Ideas Factory. And joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. Harsh, we would like to begin with the situation, the worsening situation in Myanmar, 2 months after the military coup, and the streets of Myanmar are still seeing bloodshed. Violence is raging. Condemnation from the international community and sanctions from the Western nations have not really been helpful in restoring peace there. The country is almost on the verge of a civil war. So India has reiterated that it stands for restoring democracy, but there have been some questions raised on the presence of Indian Defence Attaché at an event of Myanmar military. I would like you to explain it to us. What should India's role be? Does India really need to relook at its Myanmar policy? And what all can be done by the international community, or what are the possibilities of restoring democracy in Myanmar? We are also seeing an influx of refugees in the northeastern states here in India, so it directly affects India.
Yes, I think the situation in Myanmar is getting bloodier. It's the military feels that they can, at least for the moment, they can get away with this violence, and there is a sense that perhaps because of this, of certain geopolitical factors, the pressure on Myanmar's military junta will not be that great. Now, I think there are two aspects to the issues that you've raised. One is the international and global aspect, where clearly there has been condemnation. The Western world has reacted with sanctions, and the challenge now is how do you operationalize that condemnation into something much more concrete when it comes to Myanmar, and whether that would push Myanmar in a direction in which I think a large part of the world wants Myanmar to go. As we know, what Myanmarese generals have said, some of the comments that have come out, they have been saying that, look, we have been under sanctions for so long. Do we really care about these sanctions that are being imposed? And particularly at a time when the world is not unified, especially China remains one of the most potent supporters. China was the country that said, when the coup happened, it was a cabinet reshuffle, and so in that sense, the Chinese shield has become stronger for Myanmar, and there have been reports that perhaps Chinese knew what was going to happen, and that was and their go ahead was the reason why Myanmar underwent the military junta went forward with the coup, despite the fact that the rest of the world was telling Myanmar very clearly that this would not be tolerated. So clearly, Myanmar has calculated, or the military has calculated, that perhaps the costs at this point do not outweigh the benefits, which in their case they feel that for them the larger issue here is whether they would be relevant in Myanmar politics or not. And whether one of the reasons why this coup actually happened also pertains to the fact that they looked at the spectacular victory of Aung San Suu Kyi's party in last November's election, and they were worried that perhaps now that Aung San Suu Kyi and her party will be coming to the parliament in such a big way, with this massive mandate and with this explicit desire to reform certain aspects of the constitution, they would become marginal in Myanmar politics. So I think the larger reality for Myanmarese military remains that they do not want to become subservient to the civilian authorities. And as we know, unless that happens, unless the military recognizes that, in democratic evolution is just not possible. So clearly, there is a global context to it. The second aspect which you had raised was about India, and how India has been, has reacted some aspects which perhaps have not gone down well with certain sections in India and abroad. But the challenge for India is much different than the challenge, say, for the Western world. The Western world is not really a neighbor in that sense of what is happening in Myanmar. And as you were pointing out, it's a real time issue for us. Immigration happens, large scale influx of migrants is already happening. We are northeast is still, the bordering states in our northeast still facing the challenge of how do you manage this crisis. There is also a larger issue of northeastern security, which becomes in jeopardy the moment you antagonize the Myanmarese military. And to be fair, Myanmarese military government has been a partner as far as India is concerned in managing the border much more effectively than before in recent years. So for India, that's one aspect of the challenge. The other aspect is, of course, that if the West is determined to isolate Myanmar, then Myanmarese military will go into the Chinese fold. In any case, the China factor is increasing many-fold in Myanmar over the last 2 decades. Certainly now with the West saying that, look, we are not interested, we are going to isolate you, we are going to sanction you, the only alternative becomes that country that goes into the China fold, and that we have seen one country to another. And despite India's very cautious attempts to make the Western world understand that this has not really worked in most cases. If you look at it, even Iran, for example, what has happened in Iran after Trump withdrew from JCPOA, we are seeing a greater imprint of China in Iran today. And the latest defense agreement that has been signed once again proves that point. Similarly, Myanmar can also go that way, and India does not want that, particularly now when India is facing the China challenge from multiple folds. So clearly, India has to balance that aspect, the geopolitical aspect, with this, with a clear recognition that ultimately democracy is the only way to go, and democracy is, has to be strengthened. But India would like the channels of communication to remain open with all the stakeholders, including the military. And I think the talk when it happens that we just have to isolate the military, that does not really resonate with India. So if you look at the Indian statement, which has been actually very robust in the UN Security Council, the statement is very categorical that we want the aspirations of the people of Myanmar to be respected and the democratic process restored. But we also want to look forward, and we also want to make sure that all stakeholders are on board, because ultimately the future of Myanmar will have to be determined by the people of Myanmar, by the institutions of Myanmar. And if all the stakeholders are not on board, then clearly whatever the West might say, the democratic transition will become very difficult. The democratic transition will often take the step of what is happening today, one step forward and two steps backwards. So I think the challenge that India faces is the challenge of its vicinity, the challenge that it faces enormous geostrategic challenges in the region, in which Myanmar is a very important partner, including the fact that India looks at Myanmar as a gateway to Southeast Asia, and also the larger reality of China hovering around India's vicinity. So while India is balancing this out, I think some amount of back and forth is likely to happen between other stakeholders and India. And one expects that it won't be a smooth ride for New Delhi as well. It will be a bumpy ride, but that's the challenge of a difficult neighborhood.
It's a big and complex challenge. China hovering in the vicinity, along with that, like we spoke about the influx of refugees. All that makes the problem very complicated. And the China factor that you spoke about, and the threat of Myanmar also going into the China fold, like you spoke about Iran, the Chinese imprint in Iran, that's happening with a lot of countries, Harsh. And I would like to point at the recent data that has come out of that research organization, Aid Data, that Washington-based organization that has pointed at the Chinese game of debts. China is officially the largest creditor in the world, and we all know of the Chinese debt trap. I mean, be it Sri Lanka or many other developing nations, or Pakistan, or the entire BRI project. What does this reveal really of China's intent, and how are the developing nations actually trapped in this game?
What this data does, this is an extraordinary set of data which researchers and organizations, 4 of them, have collected and analyzed, which was not really in the public domain. For a long time, we used to talk about debt trap, we used to talk about how Chinese are manipulating the their role as development partners, so-called development partners. But this is the first time we have data available to analyze and see. For example, in this case, they have actually, I think, gone over 100 Chinese loan contracts with around 24 low to medium middle income countries, and it presents some fascinating aspects of what we have already always been talking about, that China has emerged as a very important developmental partner for the world. That certainly cannot be disputed. It emerged as an alternative. So just the fact that China is an alternative, I think, gives countries a lot of leverage in that sense, that now it's not simply the multilateral institutions at times that are available. China is also in its own right a developmental partner. Now, as you mentioned, the largest official creditor in the world today, almost 65% of the world, in terms of debt it owns. So therefore, there is a sense that most of these countries, especially in the developing world, especially in Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and even in Asia, which are now which have signed these contracts. What kind of contracts these are now? What is interesting is that when you look when they have been there, these contracts have been analyzed. They point out that confidentiality is a big part of this. Yes. That you can't reveal what is in the contract. So clearly, not this is something that is a gold mine for researchers and for policy analysts, because for the first time we now looking at what these contracts actually say. And what they do is that they make China so indispensable by either making China the ability to restructure those loans at their own will, or by making it very clear to the borrower that first it will be the Chinese state-owned enterprises that they'll have to pay back before coming to other creditors. In the way the Chinese have privileged themselves in this developmental cooperation framework, creates this challenge of how do you reconcile Chinese unilateral instincts, even in the development cooperation aspect, with a larger shift in the development paradigm that was happening? So, development cooperation, loans and aids have always been very contentious, and they have always been linked to the self-interest of the lending countries. But over a period of time, certain norms had evolved where, all those who were giving these loans, the creditors, for example, were saying that, look, we now, because we want to, relieve some of the poorest countries of debt, we will work out certain arrangements whereby we can work within certain normative considerations. But what China has done now with its large financial muscle is completely redrawn that landscape. So China now is the biggest lender, and with that heft, it is now manipulating this aspect of its cooperation with smaller countries, which in any case require loans, which in any case require help. But now that they are coming under this enormous debt, it's not entirely clear what is the long-term trajectory of this engagement, because Chinese have given themselves enough avenues to walk out, to restructure these loans in their own interest. So I think it will be, this data has opened up enormous possibilities for greater debate and discussion on this particular issue, because it ultimately involves the poorest of the poor in the world. And therefore, for them, if the debt becomes the primary instrument, then I think we are looking at, great degree of distress over the long term. In the short term, it can help certain elites in those countries, but in the long term, this is a serious economic problem. This becomes a serious political problem, and therefore it also becomes a geopolitical problem for the world at large, where China could use this for geopolitical purposes.
Definitely, like it has earlier done in the case of Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port, or if you look at the Gwadar port. So all these are examples of what happens in this debt trap policy that China has been engaging in. Now, when we look at Pakistan, Pakistan is under a huge debt again. But when we hear Pakistan's Prime Minister proposing a trade with India and actually restarting the trade, but then going back on his words, the flip-flop that we've seen from Pakistan, how do we look at that? Of course, we know that the democratically elected government is not all powerful, and it's the ISI and the military and the pressure that it exerts on the democratically elected government. So Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan first proposing trade in sugar and cotton, and then taking a U-turn. It clearly means that there has been a lot of pressure from the ISI and the army there, and they are the ones who call the shots still.
Yes, it's quite interesting because some people were reading it as part of the evolution, perhaps in Pakistani thinking. We saw last month General Bajwa's speech about how India Pakistan need to look forward, how he was talking about connectivity in Central Asia and South Asia. He was talking about a new dawn in India, perhaps in regional cooperation, where the past should be buried and future should be acknowledged and transformed. So clearly, certainly, many thought
Yes.
when the news came that economic ministry in Pakistan is recommending imports from India. Many thought that this is perhaps the beginning of that phase where trade normalization would become part of the beginning of the long process, where perhaps it can lead to a political conversation between the two countries. But again, it seems that even this basic step is seen as too costly by various stakeholders at this particular point. And I think the question that in India we need to ask is how far can we rely on some of these comments? Because there has been a lot of commentary in India about the fact that that there is a change of mind perhaps in Pakistan, change of heart in Pakistan, a Pakistani establishment vis-a-vis India, and given their domestic challenges and regional challenges, they perhaps look at a reopening with India with certain degree of possibility. But I think what has happened in this particular case is quite intriguing and interesting, and it tells you again something about Pakistan, how difficult it is to normalize relations with Pakistan. We should also remember that it is an entirely Pakistani decision. After the revocation of Article 370, it was Pakistan that decided to ban trade, and it's now the decision is Pakistan's to revive and then to go back on it. So clearly, Pakistan is confused and is not, is not has not been able to come to terms that when it comes to perhaps Kashmir or Article 370, nothing is going to happen as far as India is concerned. So if Pakistan has to engage with India, it will have to engage with India on contemporary realities, and going
And not put conditions there.
backwards to our pre-August 2019 framework is certainly not the way to go. But I think it would. My sense is that uh, it was a trial balloon to see what kind of a political reception it would get in Pakistan, and I think the balloon burst much quicker than some people expected there.
Yeah, a very quick comment before we take a question, because we've started taking questions from some of the viewers. We have time just for one question, but a quick comment from you, Harsh, on the invite that President Biden has sent to the leaders for a virtual climate summit, and Prime Minister Modi has accepted the invitation. Now, before that, we know that the special presidential envoy in climate, John Kerry, is also visiting India before the virtual summit. The summit will reconvene the US-led major economic forum. So, this is very, very significant that's happening there.
Yes, and I think what it tells us about Indo-US relations is that environmental issues, climate change issues, and related issues, whether it comes to renewable technology, etc., will become the driver, or has the potential to become the driver in Indo-US relations going forward, given that this is going to be a priority of this administration in Washington, and given how much investment this administration is going to make. And India, therefore, is a critical anchor here. Without India, much of this discussion actually is irrelevant. And we have also seen how India has transformed its own policies, its own ambitions. India has outperformed its own targets in when it comes to climate change in some ways, and there is a degree of recognition that India has to do it for itself. And so the older paradigm, where it was looked at through a developed perspective, we are moving away from that to a perspective where India is doing it for its own citizens, for its own benefit, and therefore engaging becomes with India becomes relatively easier for the rest of the world, in particular the US, which earlier was bogged down into this older debate of many in India construed it as a pressure, and many in Washington saw India not being responsive to one of the most important challenges. I think we have moved away from that paradigm. We are now looking at for more cooperative engagement between India and the US in this, and this is going to be fundamental over the next 4 years at least, with Biden administration being in office. And therefore, John Kerry's visit will perhaps lay down some of the ideas on both sides on the table, and the summit itself would revive it as a global project.
Okay, so before we end this discussion, a very quick question from one of our viewers. There are a couple of questions, but we have time for just one. And the person asks, today India is part of groupings which represent two sides of the global divide, JAI, RIC, SCO, Quad. How do you see the evolution of such groupings in the post-pandemic, quickly polarizing world?
Yeah, that's a great question. In some ways, it reflects the sense that you get from Indian foreign policy establishment over the last few years, where they have argued that, look, we live in a very, very fluid world, and in this fluid world, we need flexibility to be able to engage with different partners. So issue-based coalitions are going to be the
Yeah.
way forward. So when it comes to SCO, we talk of counter-terrorism. When it comes to the Quad, we talk of regional security in Indo-Pacific. When it comes to RIC, we talk of issues of multilateral engagement and how multilateral institutions can be reformed, etc. So there is an element here which is about inherent flexibility in Indian thinking, the ability of India to forge coalitions based on issues, which at times can look competitive, conflictual, but from India's perspective, it is not, because India has a stake in all these conversations, and India would like to be present in all these conversations. But I think the point that this question makes is a very fundamental one: is how far can we continue with this paradigm in an increasingly polarized environment, where post-pandemic we are looking at fault lines being redrawn and India's own position evolving in a slightly more unambiguous position, especially when it comes to China. So clearly, the issues are, I think this year will reveal which direction we go to, because we are very soon going to have even the BRICS summit, and under the shadow of our border challenge with China, and what that summit how that summit evolves, what it says about its future priorities, will also will reveal the future of BRICS as well. While we know that the future of Quad looks very promising at the moment, we are not so sure about other such regional groupings at this point. And I think this year will be an important one, where we will see the evolution in these groupings, and perhaps an evolution in India's own foreign policy when it comes to the choices it is willing to make vis-a-vis these multiple platforms.
All right. Thank you so much, Harsh, for that answer. And thank you, Surya Pratap Baba, for the question. This question was asked by Surya Pratap. So, like Harsh explained, we live in a fluid world, and issue-based coalition is probably the need of the time. That's all that we have time for on this episode of the Ideas Factory. See you next week. Thank you.